So I want you to really think about this for a second. Have you ever just been sitting at your desk on a random Tuesday and had this intense, overwhelming fantasy about dropping literally everything?
Oh, the classic escapist daydream.
Yeah, like just packing a single bag, heading to the airport, and flying to some foreign city where you don't speak a single word of the language.
Just completely reinventing yourself overnight.
Exactly. We have this collective fantasy where we think, we're craving better pastries or like more picturesque European architecture.
Mm.
But what we are actually craving, I think, is the emotional resilience of the expat.
That's a really interesting way to frame it.
Yeah, because we want that superpower, right? The superpower of surviving this absolute terrifying loss of adult competence and somehow forging a brand new identity from the rubble. Because the moment you actually step off a plane in a foreign country to start a new life, your brain, well, it doesn't register the environment as some grand romantic adventure. It registers it as a severe, impending psychological trauma.
It absolutely does. I mean, the fantasy completely omits the cognitive shear of that reinvention. People vividly imagine the physical relocation, right? Like getting the apartment or walking down cobblestone streets. But they severely underestimate the neurological upheaval.
Yeah, it's massive.
It really is. Because when you strip away your entire familiar context, I mean, your linguistic safety nets, your established routines, your known social standing, you force this brutal confrontation with how much of your identity is actually tied to your external environment.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are opening up a really fascinating dossier to examine exactly how human beings sort of hack their own biology and psychology to survive this exact process.
Yeah, we have some incredible source material for this. We're looking at excerpts from a really profound discussion titled The Expat Heart, Finding Home in Faraway Places.
Yeah, featuring two individuals, Emily and Paul, who navigated this whole upheaval firsthand. And just to set the parameters for you listening right now, we're completely ignoring the logistics today.
Right, no visa talk.
Exactly. We are not giving you travel tips or visa strategies or like apartment hunting hacks. We are decoding the psychological blueprint of relocating. We want to understand the actual mechanisms of how a human being conquers these massive linguistic walls and somehow manufactures a genuine sense of belonging in an environment that is, honestly, initially kind of hostile to their existence.
And the excerpts we have from Emily's journey in the expat heart provide just a phenomenal raw data set for this
Yeah.
because she details the really granular, volatile, emotional arc of moving abroad.
The highest highs and the lowest lows.
Exactly. She starts with that immediate euphoria of arrival and then crashing into the absolute depths of homesickness and then finally outlining the specific and honestly often counterintuitive strategies she used to construct a new life. It allows us to examine the profound adaptability of the human mind when it's forced into a state of total environmental alienation.
Because that initial act of moving abroad, taking that very first step out of the airport terminal with all your bags, it is fundamentally different from visiting a new country on a 2-week holiday.
Oh, entirely. Night and day.
It's like stepping onto a completely new planet where the fundamental physics of human interaction have just been rewritten.
I like that. A new planet.
Yeah, imagine landing on a world where, you drop your keys and instead of falling to the ground, they just float sideways.
That would be terrifying.
Right. But that's what it feels like socially. The architecture looks somewhat familiar, the streets are paved, the people have 2 arms and 2 legs, but the invisible binding rules of reality are suddenly totally alien. Every automatic social process you've relied on your entire life is suddenly obsolete.
Because that invisible physics you're talking about, that's your cultural and linguistic programming. And its sudden obsolescence triggers massive cognitive dissonance. On this new planet, the autonomic processes you take for granted, like the micro expressions you use to signal politeness.
Yep, little nods and smiles.
Exactly. Or the tonal shifts you use to ask a question without sounding rude. Even the physical proximity you maintain when ordering a coffee. All of that suddenly requires conscious, agonizing, deliberate calculation.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
It is incredibly taxing. The brain is suddenly forced to use active processing power for tasks it normally just relegates to background automation. And the source material illustrates this beautifully by contrasting the initial kind of passive reception of the new environment with the active, aggressive demands it eventually places on you.
Okay, let's trace Emily's specific arrival in Paris from the text because it perfectly captures that deceptive initial phase. She describes her initial sensory experience as pure magic.
The honeymoon phase.
Exactly. She stepped into this vibrant universe where the sights, the ambient sounds, the smells, she says it wraps around her like a warm, welcoming hug. She is completely basking in the romance of the city. The environment is just watching over her, and her brain is interpreting this entirely as a positive, euphoric event.
Well, sure, because the neurochemistry of that specific moment is driven entirely by novelty and dopamine. But more importantly, it's driven by the passive nature of those stimuli.
Passive? What do you mean?
Well, think about it. The smell of fresh bread, the sight of historical architecture, the ambient hum of a foreign language. All these physical environmental factors offer themselves to her without requiring any reciprocal output.
Oh, right. She doesn't have to do anything to smell the bread.
Exactly. The city is performing, and she is merely the audience. Her cognitive load is essentially zero at that point, because the environment is not yet demanding that she assert her agency or communicate her needs. That's what creates that classic honeymoon phase of relocation.
But then the honeymoon just absolutely shatters, right? The absolute second she attempts to cross that threshold from a passive audience member to an active participant.
It's a brutal transition.
The text gives us this really visceral scene. She walks into a cozy cafe. She sees a pain au chocolat in the display case, and she simply wants to buy it. I mean, this is the most basic, elemental transaction a human can possibly engage in.
Just exchanging money for calories.
Exactly. But when she opens her mouth, the words come out as this garbled mess. She hits what she describes as a massive wall. She says she felt trapped in a slapstick comedy where the city that was literally just hugging her is suddenly this locked fortress.
We can actually define this sudden, precipitous collapse of capability as a form of temporary societal aphasia.
Societal aphasia. Wow.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance here is violent. The passive environment, the sights, the smells is still incredibly inviting, but the functional environment requires a linguistic key that she just does not possess yet.
Right.
Consider the psychological implications for a second. You are a fully formed, complex adult. You possess advanced reasoning, emotional depth. Maybe you have a highly specialized career, decades of lived experience. Your internal monologue is incredibly rich and nuanced.
You're a whole person.
Right. Yet when placed in front of a baker in Paris, you are instantly stripped of all that utility. Your intellect is entirely decoupled from your ability to interact with the world.
It's honestly like being a toddler trapped inside an adult's body.
That's a perfect analogy.
Because all the sophisticated thoughts are firing perfectly in your brain, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know exactly the precise dimensions of what you want from the world. You just want that pastry, but you lack the fundamental mechanical levers to actually extract it. So you're left pointing and gesturing and like grunting at a croissant while your internal monologue is writing tragic poetry about the humiliation of the whole moment.
And that disparity, that huge gap between your receptive understanding and your expressive capability, that is the core engine of expat exhaustion. You can perceive the complexity of the world around you, but you cannot project your own complexity back into it.
That's devastating.
It really is, because the ego relies on a baseline sense of competence and mastery to maintain self-esteem. So when your communicative ability regresses to that of a child, the environment essentially reflects back to you that you are helpless. This isn't just mildly frustrating. It forces a complete, often painful dismantling of how you view your own agency.
And the daily friction of trying to perform basic survival tasks while battling that societal aphasia, it depletes the ego incredibly fast.
Absolutely. You run out of emotional battery by noon.
Right. So if the daily friction of slamming headfirst into that linguistic wall inevitably leads to total ego depletion, how do we hack the process? Because, I mean, you can't just hide in your apartment until you magically absorb the language through the walls.
No, osmosis doesn't work for language acquisition, unfortunately.
But you also can't continuously throw yourself against the wall in bakeries until your self-esteem is just completely pulverized, right? So the text introduces this thing Emily calls the local cafe trick.
Yes, this is a fascinating strategy.
But I have to ask, sitting in a cafe eavesdropping on people, it sounds dangerously close to just retreating from the challenge altogether. Isn't she essentially just hiding behind a latte to avoid the humiliation of the bakery?
I can see why it looks that way. It might appear as a retreat, but psychologically, it is actually a highly calibrated mechanism for biological acclimatization.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, the text specifies that she doesn't go to some tourist center where everyone speaks English. She intentionally seeks out a local haunt where the actual residents congregate. And by adopting what she calls the mindset of an anthropologist in her own life, She intentionally alters her relationship with the environment.
Because she's not trying to buy anything complex anymore.
Exactly. When she tried to buy the pastry, she was on stage. The spotlight was on her, and the penalty for linguistic failure was acute, immediate public embarrassment. But by positioning herself as an observer, she removes the pressure for reciprocal output. She is no longer failing to speak. She is successfully observing.
Oh, I see. So she is neutralizing the threat of the environment by intentionally removing herself from the transactional equation.
Precisely.
But the text claims that this passive observation actually created a genuine sense of belonging for her, even if it was just a silent relationship with the barista. How does sitting silently in a corner drinking espresso generate actual belonging?
It happens through the neurological phenomenon of ambient belonging and rhythmic entrainment.
Rhythmic entrainment. That sounds very sci-fi.
It kind of is. So your parasympathetic nervous system requires environmental predictability to lower your baseline stress levels.
Mm.
When you first arrive in a foreign culture, the unpredictability of literally everything, the noise, the gestures, the social pacing, it keeps your nervous system in this low-level, constant state of fight or flight.
Because everything is a potential threat or unknown variable.
Right. But by simply sharing physical space with the locals on a regular basis, literally breathing the same air, and allowing her mirror neurons to process their interactions without the anxiety of having to respond, she is teaching her nervous system that the environment is actually safe.
That is wild. It's the equivalent of downloading a massive background software update for the brain.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, the conscious mind isn't actively studying grammar textbooks in the cafe, but the subconscious is aggressively mapping the new parameters of the planet. I mean, she might not be learning the exact conjugation of a French verb by eavesdropping on an argument 2 tables over, but she is absorbing the prosody of the language.
The prosody, the cadence, the acceptable volume levels for public discourse. Even the physical proximity people maintain when they're arguing versus when they're flirting. She is downloading the kinesics and the spatial mapping of the culture.
All while just sipping coffee.
Yeah. The software update analogy is entirely accurate because language acquisition is not merely about memorizing vocabulary flashcards. It is about mapping the social architecture in which that vocabulary operates. By the time she eventually decides to initiate a real conversation, her nervous system has already adapted to the physical rhythm of the exchange, which vastly reduces the cognitive load of the interaction.
But, the software update eventually has to finish, right? And you actually have to run the application.
You do. You can't be an anthropologist forever.
Exactly. You
Well-
cannot remain the silent observer. And that leap going from passive observer to active participant, that is arguably the most dangerous threshold. And the source gives us this brilliant, really spontaneous example of how this happens for Emily. She accidentally finds herself swept into a passionate, rapid-fire discussion with locals about a soccer match.
Yes, the soccer anecdote is crucial. And the critical variable in this story is her complete lack of technical proficiency regarding the subject matter.
Right. She explicitly admits in the text that she knows absolutely zero about soccer.
Nothing. Furthermore, her linguistic proficiency is still incredibly low at this point. Yet the outcome of this interaction is described as this fantastic exchange of oohs and ahs that magically blossoms into a genuine friendship, which logically makes no sense. It bypasses the logical requirements of conversation entirely.
Because it bypasses the language centers of the brain entirely. Like, she isn't using Broca's area to formulate a tactical analysis of the offside rule. She is utilizing pure limbic resonance.
Limbic resonance, thinks it.
She is looking at these highly animated, passionate people, and instead of trying to match their vocabulary, which she literally cannot do, she decides to match their emotional frequency.
And that is the exact mechanism at play. Human beings possess this universal, hardwired capacity to transmit and receive emotional states, completely independent of semantic language. The locals in that cafe were exuding high arousal emotions, right? Excitement, frustration, pure joy.
Typical sports fans.
Exactly. And Emily's mirror neurons recognize that emotional state. So by vocally matching their oohs and ahs, she engaged in emotional contagion. The locals weren't looking for an intellectual debate about sports strategy. They were seeking communal validation of their excitement.
They just wanted someone to cheer with them.
Right. And by providing that energetic validation, she instantly converted her status from a silent, weird outsider to an active participant in their collective emotional experience.
Okay, but I have to push back and challenge this idea of vulnerability here, because vulnerability is often pitched as this, warm, fuzzy buzzword in self-help circles. But in this specific context, isn't there a huge risk? Like by enthusiastically joining a conversation about a topic you don't understand, using a language you barely speak. Aren't you just making a massive fool of yourself? Doesn't vulnerability here just look like sheer incompetence?
Well, the fear of appearing incompetent is precisely what traps most expats in a permanent state of isolation. Yes, we call it the perfectionist expat syndrome. They attempt to construct this flawless facade. They wait until their grammar is impeccable and their cultural knowledge is absolute before they ever engage.
I can totally see people doing that, just studying in their room for a year.
But evolutionarily speaking, a flawless, impenetrable facade signals a potential threat, or at the very least, an unpredictable variable. When Emily overtly displays her lack of knowledge, when she admits she doesn't know soccer, but simultaneously projects this joyful, desperate willingness to participate anyway, she is sending an incredibly powerful disarming signal. She's essentially signaling, I am not a threat, I have no status to protect here, and I defer to your expertise.
Wow, so she is actually weaponizing her own incompetence to trigger their empathy.
Precisely. The vulnerability lowers the defensive barriers of the locals. It's endearing because it requires genuine courage to abandon your ego in public like that. The locals recognize the effort, and the shared vulnerability becomes the actual foundation of the friendship, far more so than any mutual interest in the sport itself. Her willingness to look foolish transforms that linguistic wall into a window.
That is so powerful. And I imagine that transition from wall to window makes you feel invincible for a minute.
Oh, it's a huge high.
Like you finally crack the code of limbic resonance, you make a friend over a soccer game you don't even understand, you finally feel the gravitational pull of this new planet aligning with your own 2 feet. You are adapting.
I feel like you've made it.
And that is exactly when the old world decides to violently ambush you.
Yep, the crash.
The text transitions here into this stark, visceral discussion of homesickness. And I love how it's portrayed because it does not describe it as some gentle romantic yearning while staring out a rainy window.
No, the source material uses the phrase freight train to describe the impact. That phrasing is clinically significant because it highlights the sudden, overwhelming, and destabilizing nature of the phenomenon. Homesickness, in this context, is not a chronic, low-grade melancholy that you slowly build a tolerance to.
It's an ambush.
It is an acute psychological ambush, triggered by highly specific environmental cues.
And the triggers listed in the text are fascinatingly mundane. Like, Emily mentions suddenly craving a highly specific pizza place from her hometown, or just hearing a random familial pop song playing over the speakers in a foreign pharmacy. You spend months building up your localized armor, mastering the cafe trick, making the soccer friends, and then you step on an emotional tripwire. A song plays, and your entire sense of stability instantaneously unravels. Why does the brain set these traps for us? I mean, why does a 3-minute pop song possess the power to completely shatter months of psychological adaptation?
To understand the devastating power of that tripwire, we really have to examine how the brain encodes and retrieves memory, specifically the pathways involving the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the olfactory bulb.
Okay, let's get into the neuroscience.
So memories are not stored in your brain like files in a filing cabinet. They are isolated text documents. They are encoded as vast, interconnected webs of sensory data. When Emily hears that specific pop song in the pharmacy, her auditory cortex processes the sound, and her hippocampus instantly retrieves the entire emotional and physical context historically associated with that stimulus.
It pulls up her old living room, her old friends, the predictable comfort of the old planet. It essentially downloads the safety of her past life directly into her present consciousness.
Exactly. And that is where the psychological shear occurs, because the brain momentarily anticipates the safety and predictability of the old environment based on the sensory cue of the song. But when the song ends, or when she simply opens her eyes and observes the alien streets of Paris, the anticipated reality violently misaligns with the actual physical environment.
The reality check.
Right. The brain is thrust into a state of acute spatial and emotional disorientation. The sensory trigger promised the profound safety of home, but the physical reality delivers the overwhelming friction of the new world. That immediate jarring disparity between expectation and reality is what generates the physical impact of the freight train.
So homesickness is literally a glitch in your sensory processing. Your brain accidentally loads the old software map, realizes it doesn't match the new GPS coordinates, and completely crashes the entire system.
That's a very accurate way to describe the neurology of it, yes.
So when the crash happens and you are completely unschooled, sitting in your apartment and crying over a craving for that specific hometown pizza, How do you reboot? Because the source definitely does not suggest just waiting out the storm and dead. It prescribes a very active antidote based on this concept of small victories.
Yes, and the text provides a remarkably profound anecdote to illustrate this antidote. So, Emily is experiencing a severe bout of this homesickness. The freight train has hit her hard. But instead of surrendering to the isolation, she forces herself out into the environment and takes a stroll through a local street market.
Which is brave, honestly.
It is, and there she encounters an elderly vendor selling flowers.
And the language barrier is still firmly in place here, right? Like, the vendor only knows a handful of English words. She is still struggling immensely with her French. But they engage in this clumsy, highly physical exchange using laughter and exaggerated gestures. And the climax of the story is stunningly simple. As she leaves, the elderly man hands her a small bouquet of flowers and simply says, "For my friend." And the text describes the moment as magical, which honestly feels almost like an understatement given the psychological context of what she was going through.
Oh, the psychological weight of those three words, "for my friend," it really cannot be overstated. When the freight train of homesickness hits, it systematically dismantles your ego. The internal narrative shifts rapidly toward catastrophic isolation. You start telling yourself, "I do not belong here. I am incompetent. I am invisible to these people."
Just spiral.
Exactly. The interaction with the flower vendor serves as an immediate physical disruption of that catastrophic narrative.
Okay, but I want to press on a very specific psychological quirk regarding this validation, because this is fascinating to me. Let's say she walked away from the flower vendor, went back to her apartment, and immediately called her mother, or maybe her lifelong best friend back home, for a 2-hour comfort session on FaceTime. Why is it that the simple, almost silent gesture from a complete stranger, a guy selling flowers, often holds vastly more immediate emotional healing power than a deep, loving conversation with a lifelong friend? Shouldn't the lifelong friend provide the ultimate psychological safety net?
It's a great question. The lifelong friend does provide validation, yes, but it is the wrong type of validation for the specific crisis of relocation.
What do you mean?
When you call your best friend back home, they are validating your old identity. They are confirming that you were loved, that you were competent, and that you were valuable in the context of the old planet.
Right.
And while that provides temporary comfort, it fundamentally exacerbates the homesickness because it highlights the exact absence of that comfort in your current reality. It reinforces the idea that your true value exists solely in the past, thousands of miles away.
Oh my God. That is a staggering realization. The phone call home actually widens the cognitive shear. It reminds you of exactly what you cannot have right now.
It's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that with the flower vendor. When the vendor hands her the flowers and acknowledges her as a friend, he is providing prospective validation. He is validating her new, localized identity.
He's seeing who she is right now, in Paris.
Exactly. He is offering undeniable, tangible proof that she exists, that she is acceptable, and that she has the capacity to generate value and connection on the new planet, despite her linguistic aphasia. The lifelong friend offers a lifeline anchored in the past. The stranger offers a localized anchor in the present. Rebuilding the ego requires localized anchors. That small victory of the flower is proof of concept that survival is actually possible here.
Wow. A localized anchor. That makes so much sense. And the necessity of those localized anchors brings us to a really fascinating logistical debate that the source material uses to reveal a deep psychological truth.
A packing philosophy.
Yes. If true comfort and survival in a new place rely entirely on these intangible moments of connection, like the shared limbic resonance over soccer, or the localized validation from a flower vendor, what does that mean for the literal, physical objects we obsessively stuff into our suitcases when we move? I like to call this the packing paradox.
The packing paradox. I love that. The Force provides a highly specific packing philosophy that perfectly illustrates the tension between physical control and psychological adaptability. Emily explicitly observes the tendency of expats to wildly overpack, noting with some real amusement that people attempt to bring everything imaginable. She specifically cites the absurdity of people packing pots and pans.
I find the pots and pans detail absolutely hilarious because it is so fundamentally irrational. You are moving to Paris. a city that has arguably mastered the art of culinary infrastructure, and you are wasting 50 pounds of your luggage allowance dragging your own heavy metal frying pan across the Atlantic Ocean.
It makes no logical sense.
None. And Emily contrasts this heavy kitchen sink mentality with her own hyper-targeted list. She advises packing meaningful photos, small mementos, climate-appropriate clothing, electronics adapters, and crucially, she insists that you must pack the specific spices from your home kitchen.
The irrationality of packing the frying pan reveals the profound anxiety of relocation. The pots and pans are not packed for their utility. They are packed for their psychological weight.
Literally and figuratively.
Exactly. They represent a desperate, anxiety-driven attempt to physically transport the infrastructure of your old life. When the internal environment, your mind, feels completely out of control, humans attempt to exert extreme control over their physical environment. The frying pan is a heavy metal guarantee of routine, but the source argues that attempting to replicate your old infrastructure is a fatal error in adaptability.
Because dragging the heavy infrastructure of the old world prevents you from plugging into the infrastructure of the new world. You are literally weighing yourself down with the gravity of your past. Emily's list is brilliant because it prioritizes psychological portability over physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
Like, the photos anchor your foundational relationships. And the electronics adapters, I think they're the perfect metaphor for the expat mindset. You acknowledge and accept that the power grid of the new country is entirely different. You can't change their sockets, but you bring the exact tool required to interface your existing energy with their infrastructure.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. The contrast between the heavy metal of the frying pan and the near weightlessness of the spices is the absolute crux of the packing paradox. Bringing massive kitchen equipment is an attempt to build a fortress against the new culture. Bringing a small collection of spices is a fundamentally different strategy. It signifies a healthier, highly adaptable mindset that understands that identity is not tied to heavy infrastructure, but to sensory memory.
I look at the jar of spices as carrying a highly compressed ZIP file of your entire cultural identity.
The ZIP file. Okay, explain that.
Think about the efficiency of it. A single jar of a specific chili blend or a proprietary family spice mix, it weighs practically nothing in a suitcase. It requires zero infrastructure. But the moment you open it, unpack it, and apply heat to it in a foreign kitchen, it instantly unzips.
It expands.
Yes. It expands rapidly to fill the entire phagal space with the exact, highly specific sensory data of your childhood, your holidays, your family history. You are utilizing a few grams of powder to artificially hijack your own olfactory bulb and instantaneously lower your cortisol levels.
The ZIP file analogy perfectly captures the neurobiological efficiency of olfactory memory. As we discussed with the triggers of homesickness, smells bypass the thalamus and route directly to the amygdala and hippocampus.
Yeah.
So you are essentially carrying a chemical override switch for your nervous system.
Which is basically magic.
It is.
Yeah.
But what the source material emphasizes is that these spices are not merely used as a private coping mechanism. They're not just a way to self-soothe in isolation. The true power of the ZIP file is how it is deployed to construct spontaneous community.
Right. Which brings us to the concept of culinary anchors. The text explicitly notes that cooking connects you to your roots, with Emily describing the process of making a dish from her culture as feeling like wrapping yourself in a warm blanket.
But she doesn't stay wrapped in the blanket alone.
Exactly. The text details this incredible event where she decides to cook a highly specific, complex family recipe for Thanksgiving while living abroad. Now, Thanksgiving is a uniquely American holiday. Nobody in her Parisian apartment building has any cultural context for it whatsoever. Yet the act of cooking this meal organically morphs into a spontaneous, building-wide potluck where her neighbors end up bringing down their own diverse regional dishes to share.
If we analyze the sociology of food in the context of the expat experience, it emerges as the ultimate nonverbal social lubricant and the primary mechanism for cultural bridging.
Universal language.
Exactly. The Thanksgiving narrative is the absolute synthesis of the psychological blueprint we've been decoding today. She begins from a position of intense vulnerability and potential isolation craving connection to her roots on a day that the surrounding culture simply does not recognize. But instead of retreating into her apartment and privately mourning the absence of her family, she externalizes the ZIP file.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Isn't the act of cooking a massive, highly specific meal from your home country and forcing that tradition into a space where it doesn't belong just a psychological way of building a walled garden? Isn't she essentially saying, I refuse to assimilate today, I'm going to make you participate in my culture?
I see the point, but it would only be a walled garden if she demanded they understand the historical nuance of the holiday, or if she rejected their input. But the mechanism of the potluck changes the dynamic entirely. Well, think back to the societal aphasia we discussed earlier. When you are suffering from that linguistic aphasia, your personality is muted. You cannot demonstrate your humor, your intellect, or your care for others using vocabulary. But cooking a complex, culturally distinct meal is a nonverbal assertion of high-level competence.
Oh, wow.
You are silently demonstrating your capability and your heritage. When she offers the food to her neighbors, she is basically saying, I cannot explain who I am to you in French, but I can show you the richness of my history through this plate.
She is essentially translating her identity into a medium that bypasses the language wall entirely.
Exactly. And by offering that deeply personal, vulnerable piece of her identity to the neighbors, she triggers the rule of reciprocity. She actively invites the locals to share their own vulnerability. The fact that the neighbors returned with their own diverse dishes proves that the act was not a retreat, but an invitation. She transformed the acute isolation of homesickness into a hybrid communal space. It is no longer a matter of the expat simply assimilating into the host culture. It is the creation of a micro-community where both cultures validate each other.
That alchemy turning the absolute vulnerability of isolation into the foundation of a new hybrid community that really is the ultimate triumph of the expat mind. And it all connects back to the strategies we've mapped out for bypassing that initial terrifying wall of language.
It's all connected.
Whether it's matching the emotional frequency of the soccer fans through limbic resonance, or accepting the localized validation of the flower vendor to rebuild the ego, or unzipping the cultural file of your spices to spark a neighborhood potluck, these are all incredibly sophisticated psychological tools for asserting your existence when the fundamental physics of your environment have been rewritten.
And this brings all the conceptual threads of the source material into a unified theory of human adaptability. What Emily and Paul are ultimately arguing in The Expat Heart is that surviving the relocation is merely the baseline. The true objective, as Emily states, is thriving. It's embracing the friction of change and utilizing that cognitive dissonance to fuel profound personal growth.
Because you don't do all this to stay the same.
No, you do not move across the world to remain the exact same person you were. You move to discover who you become when your safety nets are entirely removed.
The journey requires an active, conscious dismantling of your old ego and the terrifying, meticulous reconstruction of a new one. It demands that we confront our reliance on the passive, warm hug of the honeymoon phase and accept the active, exhausting work of the background software update.
You have to do the work.
We have to be willing to look foolish, right? To play the anthropologist in the cafe and to endure the inevitable freight train of sensory misalignment when the old world calls out to us through a pop song.
And the final takeaway from the source material encapsulates this beautifully. Emily explicitly advises anyone undertaking this psychological upheaval to keep an open heart and mind, because the unexpected variables you encounter will irrevocably alter your perspective.
In the best way possible.
Yes. She notes that the journey dictates you pack your courage, leave vast amounts of internal space for new localized relationships, and fully embrace what she calls the sticky, beautiful connections you will undoubtedly forge along the way.
Sticky, beautiful connections. I love that. That specific phrasing is incredibly evocative because it acknowledges the reality of the process. The relationships you build on the new planet are rarely clean, frictionless, or easy. They are messy.
It's very messy.
They're built on garbled vocabularies, awkward physical gestures, and embarrassing misunderstandings. But that shared friction makes them adhere to you. They become the structural foundation of who you are in the new world. Which I think leaves us with a final lingering premise for you listening to turn over in your own mind after we close the dossier today.
Let's hear it.
Imagine the daydream finally takes hold. You buy the one-way ticket, you step off the spaceship onto the new planet where the gravity works differently, and your adult competence instantly vanishes. If you were forced to leave all the heavy infrastructure of your past behind and you could pack just one single highly compressed metaphorical spice, whether it's a literal ingredient, an auditory trigger, a specific morning ritual, or a philosophical lens to instantly hijack your nervous system and make a completely alien environment feel like home.